Our text this morning, our overriding text, is going to be Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2. And this is going to wind up our Skillful Living series from the book of Proverbs, where we've been kind of topically going throughout the book and taking a look at what it means to live skillfully. And keep in mind, the word skill that I'm talking about comes from the word wisdom, which Proverbs is all about how to be wise, how to live a more skillful life. So let's conclude the series today with Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. So you got kind of a parallel idea going on here. With one, you've got pride at one end of the spiritual spectrum, you might say, and then you have humility at the other end of the spiritual spectrum. Pride brings on disgrace. I could say pride has a way of making you live very unskillfully. But on the flip side of that, humility brings about wisdom, or humility brings about skill when it comes to living skillfully before God. So pride is something that we want to steer clear of. Every lesson that we've looked at in this series will fall flat on its face if we are proud people. Pride is the opposite of wisdom, and we must steer clear of it. So what does it mean to be proud? It's kind of hard to define, but you know it when you see it. The Hebrew word itself carries the idea of being arrogant. It carries the idea of being insolent. It carries the idea of being presumptuous. And then in the New Testament, the Greek word is interesting. It refers to, actually comes from the word for bellows. You know what a bellows? You know what that is? I'm not talking about something a cow does down in the pasture. That's bellowing. But bellows were these things that they used to make wind and blow wind onto a fire to make the fire hotter and bigger and more useful. So this word pride has at its root this idea of air flowing. It also has this idea of being inflated, being blown up, being swollen. The idea is the proud person is someone who has an overly inflated idea of themselves. It's someone who is into self-exaltation. Sometimes we refer to such a person as having the big head, or someone who's full of themselves. Maybe when someone's bragging, we might say they're full of hot air. Also, the word pride carries this idea of thinking one is superior to somebody else, thinking one is better or at a higher station than somebody else, kind of a condescending kind of idea. So I think we kind of get an understanding of what pride is, even though it's somewhat hard to define. It's basically this self-exaltation. That's one of the reasons I like to tell people to beware of Facebook, because Facebook many times has become a platform where people can exalt themselves in various ways. Even the word selfie itself is very telling, is it not? You see, pride is a person who is focused on themselves. So pride is something that we definitely want to steer clear of. I'm going to give you several dangers associated with pride. Pride, for one, I'm going to say it hinders or outright prevents spiritual progress. Ideally, once you become a Christian, you're born again, you're a babe in Christ, Scripture tells us, and as time goes on, you're supposed to become more and more like Jesus. So when somebody talks about spiritual growth or spiritual maturity, that means that they're more like Jesus than they were previously. And again, ideally, as time goes by, you should become more and more like Jesus, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes people, take an exit and get off that narrow road for a while, and then sometimes people get stagnant and go backwards. But ideally, God wants you to become more and more like His Son, Jesus. And pride is something that will hinder, if not stop, your spiritual growth. Listen to what Proverbs says in Proverbs chapter 26, verse 12. There is more hope for a fool than for a man who is wise in his own eyes. More hope for a fool. Now, if you remember when we studied what a fool is a very hard-headed person. You can't tell a fool anything. But a proud person is worse off than a fool. Well, why is that? Well, the proud person tends to think they have already arrived. The proud person tends to think they already have all the answers. The proud person really is difficult to teach because it requires some humility to be taught. You have to place yourself, as a pupil under the teacher, so to speak. But the proud person, again, tends to think they know everything, so you can forget counseling a proud person. Now, we swerved into this a few weeks ago when we talked about the importance of counsel and how everybody could benefit from wise counsel. But the proud person, you can forget marital counseling, you can forget financial counseling, you can forget pastoral counseling, you can forget any kind of counseling because they've already arrived. Now, some proud people realize they don't have all the answers, but out of their pride, they won't admit it. They will not admit that they do not know all the answers. They will not swallow their pride and admit they are wrong. They won't admit they need help. So that makes them very difficult to teach, and it makes spiritual progress very difficult for them because in order to progress spiritually, you have to realize that you got a long way to go, and you need to make the effort to continue to kind of grow because you're not there yet. Also, the Bible tells us that God is against the proud. You see, when we're proud and we're arrogant and we're full of ourselves, we're actually in a state of spiritual conflict with God. James chapter 4, verse 6 states, God opposes the proud. Of course, he's picking that up from the Old Testament. God opposes the proud. That word oppose is a military word which means to go to war with. I don't know about you, but I don't want God going to war with me. Life's difficult enough as it is. I don't need anything extra going against me. But it says here in the text that God is opposed. He fights against people who are proud. He resists them. He resists those who are full of themselves. We really can't, again, progress spiritually if we're full of pride. We're about as far away from Jesus as you can get when we're proud. And that's what spiritual progress, again, is all about, becoming more and more like Jesus Christ. Second, pride also poisons relationships. Proverbs 13:10 informs us, pride only breeds quarrels. The proud person is difficult to get along with. Why? Well, because they won't give in. They won't admit when they're wrong. They demand their own way. They tend to want control. They will not listen. They are insensitive. All those are characteristics of pride, which makes having a harmonious relationship with somebody very difficult. It is difficult to have a peaceful relationship with somebody who's proud. If there's a lot of arguing and fussing and fighting in your home, most likely pride is present somewhere. If there's a lot of gossip and backbiting going on where other people are verbally attacked or verbally run down, again, that indicates that pride is probably present. A lot of times people will gossip about other people and try to diminish others, throw shade on them, if you will, in order to make themselves look better. Again, self-exaltation. Well, what does backbiting and gossip and quarreling do? It destroys relationships. It'll destroy relationships in the home, at the in the workplace, in the neighborhood, in the church. Pride is something that pushes people apart. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, keep in mind, really, our religion is all about relationships. It's about our relationship with God, number one, and about our relationships with other people. Loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength is the first one. The other one is loving your neighbor as yourself. That's relationships. But if we're proud and arrogant, we're going to hurt our relationships. Our relationships aren't going to grow and flourish. We're actually going to be repelling people because that's what pride does. Pride does not bring people together. It pushes them apart. Again, Proverbs 13:10, pride only breeds quarrels. Also, keep in mind, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13 that without love, we're nothing. In other words, you can have everything religious has to offer, but if you don't have love, he says you do not have anything. You're nothing. And he tells us there, love is not proud. Pride will kill the love in your life. Always remember that. Third, pride also has the potential to produce stress. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that all stress and all anxiety and all worry is caused by pride. Anxiety and stress and worry can spring from a whole host of things. It comes from fear, and there's all kind of things we can be afraid of. But some forms of anxiety and worry, sometimes it comes from pride. You say, well, how is that? Well, remember, pride is the exaltation of self. Some people are so oriented towards self that they are overly concerned about keeping themselves exalted in the eyes of others. They are anxious about other people's judgments, criticisms, and evaluations. What will people think is the nagging, ever-present question. What are people going to think? This comes from their concern to keep themselves exalted in the eyes of others. And I know that's kind of heavy, but think about that for a moment. When people become so self-oriented, they're thriving on compliments, they're thriving on praise, they're living for that proverbial pat on the back. Sometimes they will stress themselves out trying to look good in the eyes of others. This kind of thing can actually consume a person. Now, you may not have ever thought about a proud person being that way. But a lot of times, pride causes some people to be people pleasers. And they're constantly trying to please others because they want to keep themselves exalted. Now, they may have some self-esteem issue that needs to be dealt with, probably do. But it all gets back to this idea of wanting to exalt one's self. You realize that some of the most proud people in the Bible were over-concerned with what people think? Who are you talking about? I'm talking about the Pharisees. Have you ever wondered why so much is written about those old Pharisees? There's only so much room in the Scripture. Why is so much of it taken up talking about those Pharisees constantly? Well, that's because we can learn from the Pharisees. The Lord does not want us to be like them. They were the epitome of pride and self-exaltation. They thrived on keeping up appearances. Jesus said, Matthew 23, 5 through 6, He said, everything they do is for men to see. They were very showy. They were all about being seen. Remember, they had these phylacteries they wore on their heads, these little boxes. They weren't so little. They made sure theirs were big boxes. And they put scripture verses in there because that was part of the Old Testament law. God said, wear my word on your head. I personally think He's meant put it in your mind. But anyway, they had these big boxes that they wore around on their head because they wanted everybody to see how religious they were. They actually had these tassels on their robes. They made sure their tassels were extra long so people could see how religious they were. They made sure that they sat in the places of honor in the synagogues and banquets. When they gave to the needy, they did it with great fanfare. They prayed standing on the street corners. When they fasted, they would disfigure their faces so that people could know they were fasting and see how much they were suffering for the Lord. So you can see how pride and keeping up appearances often go hand in hand. Furthermore, you can see how pride can even lead to hypocrisy. Now, am I saying all the Pharisees went around stressed out and worried about what other people thought of them? Probably not. Probably all of them weren't. But I feel it's safe to say that many of them probably were stressed out. There's no telling how much time they stood in front of the mirror, looking at their clothing, disfiguring their faces to let people know how much they were suffering. They probably spent a lot of time worrying about how they looked in the eyes of other people. And they were, some of them, no doubt, overly concerned about that. And I guarantee you, it led to some stress in their life. Because that's a stressful thing, always worrying about what other people think. Now that we see the seriousness of pride, let's shift gears and look at some of the sources of pride. Now, believe it or not, we can learn a lesson from the devil when it comes to this. 1 Timothy chapter 3, we see the qualifications there of elders. And one of the qualifications of being an elder in a congregation is that you must not be a recent convert. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, speaking of the candidate for elder, he said he must not be a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. So someone that's qualified to be an elder, and by the way, the word elder and pastor and overseer are all the same in New Testament. for someone to be an elder or a pastor, it can't be a recent convert, because that position of being over people could go to their head and cause them to fall into the same judgment as the devil. So apparently, the devil got puffed up with pride because of his source of authority, and that led to his downfall. So we have to be careful, even when we choose leadership here in the church. We've got to make sure they've been a Christian for a while. They need to be a seasoned Christian. I even think that just the term itself, elder, lets us know that person, it needs to probably at least be 40 years of age. Past 40 is considered elderly in New Testament. Sorry, guys and gals. I know we don't like to think of ourselves as elderly once we get past 40, but in Scripture, that was kind of the way the word was used. But also, somebody could come to the Lord 50 or 60 in life, but even then they would need to be a Christian for a while so that they don't fall into this temptation of being proud. Let's talk about the devil for just a minute, because that's what basically happened to him. It's in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 17. This is a very unusual passage. We really don't know a whole lot about the devil before creation. There's not a whole lot written about him. So we've just got a few verses that kind of give us some ideas. One is in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 12. And this is a prophecy against the king of Tyre, but mixed in with this prophecy is some information about the devil. For example, let me read this passage to you, and then we'll take a look at how this could not apply totally to the king of Tyre. Ezekiel 28:12. Son of man, take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre, and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says. So this is to the king of Tyre, but notice some of the things that are said to him. You were the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorns you, ruby, topaz, emerald, chrysolite, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I adorned you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, O guardian cherub. Now, can you see that all of that cannot apply to the king of Tyre? We don't have time to go into a major history lesson this morning, but I just want you to know that the king of Tyre was not in the Garden of Eden. And he was not a guardian cherub, which we see here in the text. Now, he might have been a nice-looking guy, because whoever's being talked about here is the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So we're talking about some gorgeous guy here, ladies. But I believe we're talking about the devil. See, sometimes people think the devil's ugly and grotesque looking, especially around Halloween time. No. Sounds like he's probably nice looking here. Notice he's flashy too. He's got a lot of bling. Did you catch that? All this jewelry and gold settings. He's flashy. But it led to his downfall. He was created with perfection. But in the end, he's expelled. See that in verse 16. And I think that's what's being talked about here in 1 Timothy when it talks about the qualification of an elder. So you don't want to become like the devil. You don't want to get puffed up because of your position, full of pride, because that's going to lead to your downfall. By the way up with God is down, and the way down is up, so to speak. When you exalt yourself, you're going to go down. But when you humble yourself in humility, that's when you're exalted. And we see that beautifully pictured in Philippians chapter 2 in reference to Jesus Christ. But again, the devil was someone who was puffed up because of his wisdom. He's very smart, very intelligent, very good looking, decked out in jewelry, got all kind of material things, but it led to his downfall. So what I want you to gather from this is anytime you have an advantage in life, whatever that advantage might be, that can lead you to become a proud person if you're not careful. Maybe you're nice looking, or you think you are. That can lead to pride. Maybe you have a lot of flash, a lot of bling, expensive clothes and jewelry, nice car, expensive car and house. These things can become sources of pride if we're not careful. Maybe you have a job with some authority with it. This can lead to pride. Again, we see that in the 1 Timothy passage. Really, any advantage you have, any accomplishment you have in life, that can lead to pride. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 8:1 that knowledge itself tends to puff people up. If you've got a high IQ and you're very smart, watch out. If you've accumulated a lot of facts in your head, be careful. Because knowledge tends to puff up. Now, I'm not advocating we all become idiots or something, but we do need to be careful. The more we learn, the more knowledge we acquire, be careful that you don't let that become a source of pride for you. It's ironic that even religion can become a source of pride. Again, I just mentioned that with the Pharisees. They were good at religion. They were good at tithing. They were good at praying. They were good at fasting. You know, they wasn't skipping synagogue. I mean, they had a lot of religious accomplishments on their checklist that they were keeping up with, but it became a source of pride for them. 1 Corinthians 13 that I mentioned earlier, what happened in the church there in Corinth, a lot of the more showy gifts had caused people to become proud. You know, the tongue speakers and all those people that could do the supernatural stuff, that became a source of pride for them. And Paul said, "Hey, man, if you don't connect love to your gift, you're nothing." That's kind of what he's getting at. You can't be proud. And a lot of times, even the spiritual gifts can puff people up. And this is ironic too. Remember Paul got a sneak peek of heaven when he was called up into the third heaven. And did you know that he got that thorn in the flesh to keep him from being conceited and proud? As much of a spiritual giant as the Apostle Paul was, he had the propensity to become proud. And I guarantee if everybody in here admitted it, we'd all admit we have these pockets of pride in our life that we all need to deal with. We need to be constantly emptying that pride out if we're going to progress spiritually. But even Paul was given that thorn in the flesh. Don't know what it is. Some suggest it's eyesight. It's just some kind of ailment, because I know a thorn is not comfortable, is it? Something was given him to keep him in a humble state so that he wouldn't be proud and puffed up. And again, it was from his great vision that he saw. Okay, so let's do a little introspection. I came across something that was pretty interesting. It's a list by Dr. William Baucus. He's a Christian psychologist. And he's put together this list, and it says it helps you identify if you have some pockets of pride in your life. So I'm going to read through his list slowly and let you think about this description of pride and see if any of these describe you. The proud person, trying to be noticed, craving attention, itching for compliments, being argumentative, hungering for praise, being impervious to reason, needing to be important, detesting the idea of being submissive, loathing the idea of admitting to wrongdoing, being strongly opinionated, demanding your own way, wanting control over others, flaunting your individual rights, refusing advice, being defensive, being critical yet resenting criticism, being thoughtless, being inconsiderate, being presumptuous, being self-righteous, imagining you're your own source of strength, overinflating your own abilities, devaluing others, boasting, inordinately worried about what others might think about you, worrying lest others talk about you behind your back, being oversensitive, thinking you have excellences you don't have, exhibiting hypocrisy, holding on to certain kinds of low self-esteem. Did I just describe your spouse? Just kidding. I doubt anybody got through that list unscathed. But I read that to you because I want you to know how sneaky, just to know how sneaky that pride can be. It's a lot like some of these other sins we've looked at in this series. Like sometimes people don't even realize it when they're greedy. And pride is much like that. We don't always recognize it when we're proud. Other people around us recognize it, but sometimes it's a blind spot for us. And I hope maybe that list would help you maybe see a little better if there's some area in your life that you need to work on. Again, God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should not only look to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. You see, that's the antidote to pride. The antidote to pride is humility. We must humble ourselves if we're going to empty our lives of these pockets of pride. I like the way John Ortberg defines humility. He says it's not convincing yourself that you have no talent, ability, or worth. Rather, it is a healthy self-forgetfulness. Then he goes on to mention some practical ways to cultivate humility in your life. One, he says, practice the ministry of the mundane. Find some simple task to do, something that everybody else is trying to avoid, and do it. But don't let yourself be noticed. It's been said the flesh whines against service, but screams against hidden service. It strains and pulls for honor and recognition. I thought that was pretty well put by Mr. Ortberg. So try to find something that needs to be done that others do not want to do, and then do it. And don't worry if anybody finds out or not. Also, he mentions allow yourself to be interrupted. Sometimes we get to the point where we think we're too important to be interrupted. Important people a lot of times hire people to screen them from others. CEOs and some preachers do that sort of thing. Some of these big churches, it's hard to even talk to the preacher. You forget about ever going out and having some coffee with him. It's hard to get to. We need to make sure that we don't get so protective of our schedule that we're not making ourselves accessible to other people. Keep yourself humble that way. Third, he suggests holding your tongue. So much of what we say is designed to impress others with what we know, how funny we are, and how sensitive or spiritual that we are. A lot of what we say many times is to exalt ourselves in the eyes of others. Again, that stems from pride. I'll close with this fable. I love this fable. It's the fable of the frog and the two ducks. The frog and the two ducks just love hanging out together. They love discovering new things together. And one day, the ducks were waddling along, and the frog was hopping along, and they came to this very deep canyon. And the ducks were thinking, hey, we would like to fly over to the other side and check out what's over there. But the problem is the frog couldn't fly. He couldn't get over there to the other side. So they were sitting there all disappointed when all of a sudden the frog, who often bragged about being the smartest frog in the world, said, hey, I got an idea. I know how we can all get across this canyon together. The frog told the two ducks to take a stick. The stick was lying there on the ground, and he said, you put one end of that stick in your mouth, and you put the other end of the stick in your mouth, and I'm going to open up my mouth, and I'm going to grab onto that stick, and we're going to fly across to the other side. All right, great idea. Great. I'm glad you came up with that, Mr. Frog. So they picked up that stick that was lying there, and one duck got one end, one duck got the other, and the frog put his big mouth around that stick, and off they flew. And they were about halfway across that canyon when they met a flock of birds. And man, that flock of birds, they were super, super impressed. They were greatly impressed with what they saw taking place. They said, what an ingenious idea. I wonder who thought of it. And hearing those words of praise and not being able to restrain himself, the frog said, I did. That beautifully encapsulates what pride's all about. The Bible said, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Hi there, I'm John Wagnon, minister of New Discovery Christian Church here in Hernando, Mississippi. and I want to thank you for visiting our YouTube channel. I do hope you enjoy the sermons, and I hope the Lord builds you up through His Word as I do my best to present it to you. If you're ever in the area, feel free to drop by and check us out live and in person. Once again, thank you for checking out our YouTube channel.